If there's one thing the Minoans are known for, it's their religion, and particularly religious symbols are everywhere in their architecture, in their art objects. And these are just kind of the primary ones that we find throughout Minoan art. So the double axe, and we'll see examples of all these in a moment. It's basically an axe with two sides. It's called the labrys, is the sort of official Minoan term for it. But it's basically found throughout Minoan art. Images of a goddess. She often holds snakes, so she's often referred to as a snake goddess, or it could be this kind of more generic female priestess goddess figure. The bull itself is associated with religion. Now, they don't worship it as a god, but we often get images of the bull heads and objects that are shaped in the shape of a bull. And the horns of consecration are also linked to the bull idea, except there are abstract images of the bull's horns. So let's look at a couple of these. This is from one of the areas, a room within the Minoan Palace of Knossos called the Shrine of the Double Axe, and the name comes from the number of double axes that were found in this particular section. You can see there a small example of a double axe. Now, according to archaeological finds on the island, the double axe was used specifically by Minoan priestesses for ceremonial uses. Of all the Minoan religious symbols, this is probably the holiest and the sort of the most important of all. And what we're looking at here is a small example, but we do actually have larger ones, and here are a couple in the museum in Crete. And you can see how the top parts there are the bronze part, and the lower part is made out of wood. They are ceremonial. We do not think that they were necessarily used to actually sacrifice any kind of animal. But if they are linked to something, it might be to the bull sacrifices or the link to the actual bull itself. The goddesses, these are two examples of the so-called snake goddesses. The famous one is one on the left. And unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, there are no temples or monumental statues to kings or gods on Crete. We do have examples of large statues that might have been made out of wood, but the only thing that survives today are examples like this one, which is made out of faience, and faience is a non-clay based ceramic. This particular one comes from the Palace of Knossos. Scholars think that she and several other smaller statues like this were mortal attendants, not gods or goddesses necessarily, but the idea of the snake goddess still lives on in the research, so we still refer to her as a snake goddess, even though we don't know for a fact that she in fact was a goddess. What you see here is a couple of common features that all of these figures have. They have the exposed breasts, which continues in the line of the fertility statues that we've seen. She holds two snakes and has a feline on her head. The idea of having power over the animal world to many suggested the divine element, and that's where the idea of her being a goddess came in. The fashion that we see here that she wears, she has this open bodice that allows the exposed breasts. She has what's called a flounced skirt, so it's kind of this layered skirt. And this is commonly found on representations of females in Minoan art. And there's a close-up there. You can see that the original, the body itself, the exposed parts of the body, the arms, the breast, the face would have all been white. The part that we're looking at here, the face, has actually been burned, and that's why it has that kind of brown discoloration there. This is the other example, also from Knossos, has similar features. You see how she has snakes. In this case, they're actually crawling up her arms and across her chest. She also has the exposed breasts. This one is less of a flounced skirt. It actually has an apron on it, but they follow the same sort of formula. Here's an example of a type of vessel known as a rhyton, and rhytons are ritual vessels. They actually have a piercing just above where the horns are, and another hole just below where the muzzle is. And the idea is that you pour liquid from one end, and it actually comes out of the other end. So this is where the two holes are, and you can see in the image on the right here that rhytons are often made in the shape of the bulls, but you see on the bottom there is an example that's a fish shape. They have other types as well. These were all ceremonial, and they're always found in religious contexts. So the idea is that perhaps they're having some sort of ritual. They pour a liquid within the actual rhyton. It could be wine. It could be, some believe, maybe blood from the sacrifice. And then these are shattered or broken in front of an altar or a fire. These are the final ones, and this is the horns of consecration. These types of large horns were found throughout the Palace of Knossos. Particularly, they were found on the rooftops. And on the image on the right there, this is part of a wall painting that actually shows these horns of consecration on the top of shrine areas within the actual palace complex. So these were meant to be seen as sort of maybe protection of the palace by having these horns all around the actual palace structures. Now, a couple of other sites we're going to look at briefly have a lot of the very, very rich finds that Crete is known for. Most of these are coastal sites. So on the east here, we have a site called Palekastro. And Palekastro is famous for its very wealthy houses. Some refer to them as townhouses. In particular, this building 5 we're going to look at here was a wealthy late Minoan townhouse, has 21 rooms in total. And it has multiple phases. The building was burnt down to the ground and abandoned except for a small reoccupation later in its history. You can see a reconstruction there in the lower right of what it might have looked like. Within this particular townhouse, and you can make out this drawing on the left here, in the depths there is a stand that would have been the base for this particular statue here on the right. This statue, also known as the young god or a kuros. So kuros is a young statue, a young male statue, a youth. We'll look at that term later on as well. But we don't know who this particular figure is. Some believe maybe it's a young god, maybe the earliest indication of what will become the later pantheon gods of Greece. For our purposes, you'd have to remember that it is a young male figure. It's called a chryselephantine because it's made out of gold and ivory. Chrysos means gold, elephantine comes from the elephant tusk. And it would have been ivory, the actual body, and then it would have had gold foil on it, and with some rock crystal inlays where the eyes were. This particular one stands about 20 inches in height. The black finish that we see on it now is because it's actually been burned from a fire. We know that the gold and ivory were imported from Egypt, and again, these coastal sites like Palekastro have that advantage that they're actually coastal and the seafarers, and they would have had contacts with places like Egypt. The pose as well is very much Egyptian, so remember the one leg forward, the one foot slightly more forward than the other one, and they follow that style as well here. You can see the feet there would have had these little inserts, or would have actually been able to be placed in a base. And you can see it's made out of multiple parts. The upper torso and the legs and such would have attached to each other, and even the arms are sort of like a doll would be, where they're actually separated, and the torso is separate and the arms get placed into the actual torso. You can see there. On the right there, you can make out a little bit of the gold foil that was preserved. Very little of that gold actually survives. And then on the left, you can see the details that these ivory carvings could have. You can see the veining, in this case, of the actual figure. Also from Palekastro is this what's called a marine-style octopus jar. Marine-style is very typical for the Minoans because they're seafarers. They have a lot of motifs that have to do with the ocean, either fish or octopi or shells. This one has an octopus that basically covers the entire vase. The tentacles kind of spread their way around the actual vase. The examples that we have here which are typical vases which is a dark decoration on a light background. This type of decoration will continue on until we get to the archaic period, which we'll talk about later on, where they're actually going to switch it to light on dark. The actual details that we have here, so you see the frontal view of the actual octopus, and then all around filling it up are other types of sea creatures, so coral, different shells, urchins. You can see a close-up there of some of the urchins and the shells that are part of it. Another coastal site is Agia Triada, that's in the west. This site can be referred to either as a villa site or a small palace to some people. It was also a very rich site, again coastal, so it would have had contact with places like Egypt. It has this piece, which is the famous harvester vase, and it's the first surviving trace of Minoan relief sculpture. What we have here is only the upper part preserved, so the lower part is actually reconstructed. It is a scene of a riotous crowd singing or shouting as they return from the field, so it's called the harvester vase, because it's representing the actual harvest itself. The material here is steatite, and it would have also had some gold leaf on it. The images of the actual figures on this follow the conventions of profile view with the eye and the frontal view like we've seen. We'll look at close-ups of this in a moment, but you actually have a couple of figures that are singing, others that are just marching behind them. A lot of detail in the actual figures themselves, in the musculature of the actual figures, their facial expressions. So we'll see close-ups of these here. So you see the procession there. On the right there, you can make out a man holding an instrument. His mouth is open. He is singing. On the left, you see a figure that is actually the oldest figure on the vase. And the way they show this is through the hair and through the sort of the longish hair. He's meant to be someone of a particular age, so potentially the leader of this group. And then here you can see the close-up of that singer. And I'll just close up even closer here to show you. So he holds the instrument, and you can see the details there on the rib cage of that singer. So the artist has basically tried to represent what one looks like when they're actually singing. So as you take that breath in, the rib cage might actually be visible. And the figures that are behind him are also singing along with him, while those that are behind them are carrying different tools of the harvest as they march in procession. The instrument he's holding, something called a sistrum, A-S-I-S-T-R-U-M, and a sistrum is an Egyptian instrument, sort of like a rattle, and you would basically hold it and shake it, and the discs would go back and forth, making a noise. It could be made out of ceramic, the one on the right, or they could be made out of metal.